I mean, we usually separate those two main paradigms, a hazard-focused one and a vulnerability approach on the other side, which some have tried to integrate in a kind of comprehensive paradigm or whatever they call it now. But it's, I mean, what strikes me now is how the main issues put forward by the vulnerability paradigm some 40 years ago have been somehow taken over or corrupted by what is still the dominant hazard paradigm. And I think it's something which is worrying. Let's just take the example of the concept of vulnerability, which was initially conceived as a social construct, looking at why some people have access to resources and means of protection, and when other people don't have access to those same resources, which are most often available locally. And this concept now, vulnerability, has been so much mainstreamed that it's being used by, or put forward by the proponents of the hazard paradigm as something linked to exposure, or often we have exposure now being part of vulnerability. So it's very much hazard focused. So it's been emptied of its essence somehow, the process behind vulnerability, which is, I think, the most important thing. So now we've got, I mean, a taxonomic approach of vulnerability where we define vulnerability so according to exposure, and then we've got a list of indicators or criteria like gender, age, physical ability, and blah, 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 and blah, 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 incomes, and others. So somehow, we've moved forward, I think, over the past 40 years, but there's a trend which is very much enhanced by the discourse on climate change, which is, I think, taking us back towards nature as the main threat, because we have to adapt to the threat somehow. And the adaptation, the concept of adaptation actually used now in the context of climate change is, I mean, reminiscent somehow of the concept of adjustment back in the 1930s or 40s. So which reemphasized this hazard paradigm, because you adjust or you adapt to nature, but you don't really look at the process and the ability to adapt as much as you don't look at the process behind vulnerabilities. It's more or less the same kind of, I mean, we're in a situation, I think, where yeah, we're being taken back or dragged back towards a very hazard-focused approach, which worries me a little bit, because yeah. I mean, we are having these debates here, and I know some disagree with me strongly, but I'm not comfortable with this kind of, for me, artificial divide between developing and developed countries, or now North and South, which is, I think, which doesn't depict the reality of who actually suffers from disasters. Those who suffer from disasters, for me, and those who are at the margin of the society, in a very large extent, maybe not all. At the margin doesn't mean that they are necessarily poor. Poor and marginal are not the same. But because of their position in the society, for many reasons, social, spatial, cultural, political, economic, they lack access to resources, again, which are available to those with more power. And this is not specific to some particular context. I mean, if you look at those who suffer from disasters in Europe or Northern America, I mean, those who suffered during Katrina in the US, the 1995 heat wave in Chicago, the 2003 heat wave in Europe, and homeless people in Europe, traveling communities in Europe, prisoners in Europe who are poor, who lack access to sanitation facilities in the prisons, and who suffer from disasters. But we lack the data to actually put this really forward. But they are exactly, I mean, they share a profile with those in India, in the Philippines, or anywhere else in Africa, I guess. Obviously, the reasons, I mean, the processes behind the lack of access and their vulnerability differs from one place to another, but they share this kind of profile, which is that they are at the margin of the society, they lack access to resources. And in terms of DRR, I think there are two things which are important. The first, to re-emphasize the importance of daily life, everyday life. I mean, Ken Hewitt in 1983 was writing that daily life foreshadows disasters somehow. I mean, we know those who lack access to resources and means of protection in everyday life are actually those who will suffer most in disasters. And again, it doesn't mean that they are all poor. You may have rich people at the margin of society. I mean, German tourists in southern France who do not have access to the decision-making process about where the campsites are, and we do not have access to information about hazards, et cetera, are somehow at the margin. So obviously, it's poverty. It's a major issue, but it's not only poverty. And being at the margin doesn't mean necessarily being poor. It's an important decision. But in the everyday decision-making process or everyday development process, they are not the mainstream or the core. And the second point, which I forgot, is that, yeah, I mean, it's how do we grant access to those resources, and how do we reduce vulnerability? And if we look at, I mean, disasters worldwide, there's no event which kills everyone. There are always survivors while other people die. There's no disasters where all buildings collapse while others withstand. There are always, I mean, buildings which withstand disaster. I mean, in the worst case, tsunami scenarios. So I think the point is that, I mean, it's possible. I'm an optimistic by nature, but I think it's possible. But we need to grant access. And the issue is that to grant this access to resources and means of protection, which are available most often, not always, but most often locally, you need those with power to share those resources somehow. So there's an inequality issue there. And this is a point I always put forward when I take my practitioner's hat somehow, is that the root causes of vulnerability are largely, not exclusively, but largely exogenous to those who are actually vulnerable. And I think it's an important point because many practitioners come in a place for a short-term training. I'm not talking about long-term involvement and advocacy, but for short-term trainings, and tell people or their participants, okay, at the end of the week, you will be less vulnerable, which I think is largely a lie. You may have marginal benefits in terms of reducing vulnerability, but you don't have, most often, a grasp on the root causes of vulnerability. So you need somehow external stakeholders to step in. And this is tricky because it means, yeah, for some maybe to share some power they don't want to share, or resources they don't want to share. So it requires some sort of structural intervention. What we can do in terms of DRR is enhancing what I call capacities. It's a concept. It's interesting because we are having those debates here in Bangalore about vulnerability, resilience somehow, but we're not talking about capacities. It's not in the Gaillard report, for example, although almost every practitioner uses the concept of capacities in vulnerability and capacities analysis, for example. And I think capacity is an important concept, as defined in 1989 by Anderson and Woodrow, for example. And those matrices have gone a long way since 1989. Those capacities are, I think, important because they are largely, not exclusively, but again, it depends how we define community, et cetera, et cetera. But they are largely endogenous in the sense that they rely upon local resources, knowledge, skills, social networks, even remittances, which are available to those who are vulnerable. So capacities and vulnerabilities are not the two ends of the same spectrum. And capacities are largely endogenous, which means that in the short term, when you're a practitioner, you have grasp on this. The point is, if you enhance capacities, you still don't address the root causes of vulnerability. So ultimately, we need both. We need reducing vulnerability, and we need enhancing capacities. The problem is to achieve that, we need a large array of stakeholders. I mean, those with power at the national or societal, I don't like this word, but societal level. We need scientists, we need government. We need the private sector, maybe in some countries. But at the same time, we need those who are vulnerable, at risk, including the most marginalized who are usually not included in this process of reducing vulnerability and enhancing capacities. And we need those who usually support them, NGOs, charities, civil society organizations. But most often, we don't have them at the same time around the same table talking about the same things on a level power relationship, using the same tools. So we've got nice initiatives coming from the bottom up, and we've got nice initiatives coming from the top down, sometimes, not always. But to me, they seldom match. We lack the matching point, and we lack the platform for those stakeholders and those actions to actually meet, physically and I mean, literally. And I think that's an important issue. That's a key issue. How do we open up a dialogue amongst those stakeholders? And how do we foster the participation of the most marginalized, who are, again, the most vulnerable, in a dialogue which is not skewed or biased towards those with more power? And this is a very tricky situation. So in our case, for example, we try to develop some participatory tools to do that. I mean, it's not the panacea, far from that. But the point is to try to open up a dialogue. And this is tricky. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know India enough. But I mean, fostering a dialogue across castes, for example, we've tried to do that in Nepal, for example. It's a very complicated task. I mean, how do you grant access to land to Dalit communities, for example? I'd like to make an analogy. When I've got a student who wants to specialize in disaster studies or in DRR, I always tell him, don't take a master's on disasters. Take a master's on everyday other issues, development studies, health, planning, whatever, but never do disasters because you put things in a silo, in a box. And you forget, usually you forget about everyday issues. So I think it's a critical point now. How do we integrate DRR into development? Do we want to dismantle all these disaster organizations? Do we want to stop lobbying for budget for disasters? For me, disaster risk reduction doesn't require much money. I mean, if it's everyday development, I mean, don't really need specific money. I think you need a bit. I mean, you need a bit to do risk assessment, to do action planning at the local level, but this is not expensive. I don't really know. I mean, I don't really know. And the fact that we are having those meetings, specific meetings on disaster means, I mean, shows somehow that we are still thinking in a silo. And the fact that, I mean, can I talk about the SDGs and I mean, potentially, I mean, in principle, it would be good not to have an SDG on disasters, which is, from what I understood, likely to happen. The perfect setting would be to have a bit of disasters in every of the SDGs. Now, is it hopeless? Is it a dream? I'm not sure, but it would be the ideal situation. Stop somehow talking about disasters. To me, climate change, adaptation, even climate change mitigation should be a subset of disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, whatever we call it, which itself should be a subset of development. The point, as we always say, is that they have the money, we have the ideas. I'm not sure if, again, having the money is the most important thing. I would prefer having the ideas, I think. The issue is more about political power and influence at the policy level, more than the money, I think. What worries me, again, is more than the climate change discourse is dragging us back towards where we were 70 or 100 years ago, basically. Discourse, again, on adaptation or mirrors what we had 70 years ago when we discussed adjustment, which was a good starting point. I mean, moving towards vulnerability, we needed this midway point. But we've moved forward since then. But now we are getting back to where we were, which is a bit worrying. The same for all, I mean, I may sound odd again, but the entire discourse on uncertainties, to me, is problematic. Because when we talk about uncertainties, it's the uncertainty of changes in the climate and hazards. So it's the uncertainty in nature. We don't, which re-emphasizes somehow the importance of nature. We seldom talk about the uncertainty in people's daily life, which is, will I have enough rice on my plate tomorrow morning? Which is actually a certainty that you won't have much rice. So, I think it's dragging us backward. And especially as well because in many instances in the climate change circles, we seem to reinvent the wheel. I mean, again, exposure being part of vulnerability seems very odd to me because we've had moved, I mean, light years away from that 40 years ago. I mean, if you're exposed to a hazard, you're not necessarily vulnerable. I mean, you may have enough resources, means of protection to, I mean, secure your life and livelihood somehow. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's taking us backward.
So,
which doesn't preclude climate change to be an important issue.
Yeah,
Don't misquote me for that. I mean, we need to consider climate change as we need to consider other creeping environmental changes, as Mickey Glantz would put forward, for example. I mean, we need to consider climate change as we need to consider or sea level rise as much as we need to consider land subsidence, anthropogenic land subsidence. For example, in the Philippines, in the region where I spend my time when I'm there, sea level rise is 1 cm every 10 years, I think, but land subsidence in some places is 3 or 4 cm a year because of anthropogenic pressure.
right.
I'm not saying demographic
Right.
growth, huh?
Yeah,
Some human factors. So we can't look at climate change in a silo. get back to basics, get back to where we were 40 years ago, which may be a bit upsetting for some. We've been citing with a few of us here references from the 1970s and 1980s. I mean, the greats like, Ken Hewitt, Fred Kenny, Ben Wisner, Phil O'Keefe, Claude Meillassoux, Jean Coppens, Eric Waddell, Torrey, and plenty others, Tony Oliver Smith. Let's get back to what they said 40 years ago, 30 years ago. And I know it's difficult. It may be a bit maybe impossible somehow, although I'm an optimistic, and I would think that we can get back there. At my level, I try to focus more on community work, which is very rewarding, less frustrating. I would believe in advocacy from the bottom up to try to open up this dialogue from the bottom up, not from the top down. I'm not talking about revolutions, I'm talking about lobbying, advocacy. The Philippines, if we've had a new law now since 2010, it's largely because of 13 years of lobbying by civil society organizations, a few academics, NGOs, guys who've changed their mind and now collaborate with the government and do fantastic stuff. And it led to a new law which is not perfect, but which is progressive. So I would believe in this kind of civil society approach. Obviously, it would be different from one country to another, depending on how vibrant the civil society is. Just one example, for example. I was in Mexico last year for 2 months as part of my sabbatical research leave. And Philippines and Mexico share a very strong cultural and historical heritage, because the Philippines was under the vice crown of Mexico for centuries under a Spanish colonial regime. And I was expecting that in terms, culturally, it's strong similarities. And I was expecting, wrongly obviously, that in terms of DR, because Mexico, we hear a lot about Mexico. But in Mexico, you get a very top-down structure. You've got a very vibrant, somehow, civil society. There are rallies for everything in Mexico, which is fantastic. But there's absolutely no matching point or platform for dialogue as we have in the Philippines. And I can't explain why. But this is a major impediment, I think, to move forward. NGOs seem to be fairly new when it comes to DR in Mexico. So in terms of representing the civil society on the table of negotiation with government agencies, doesn't seem to me to actually really work as it works in the Philippines. So this matching point, how do we get this integration of actions, of knowledge, scientific and local or outside and inside, is things, one of the things we need to work on, I think. As well as, because if we want to have large-scale outcomes, it's an important point, I think. If we want to have large-scale DRR or DRM outcomes worldwide, we need, I think, legislations. We can't rely on isolated, fantastic project by NGOs, sometimes bad, sometimes fantastic. Because, if we want to have large-scale horizontal outcomes, we need the state and local government as representative of the state to step in. And we need institutional frameworks fostering good practices, and we need those institutional frameworks to be implemented by local government on a large scale. Otherwise, we won't succeed, I think. I think the Gaillard's done a great job so far, especially in terms of putting forward the importance of what the document called extensive risk, which I would call small-scale disasters. I think it would be a good time in 2015 to sort of reflect upon the larger picture, maybe. We have been GARs focusing on different kind of sectoral issues.
Right.
Maybe a good time to step back a bit and reflect upon where we are now from a scientific perspective, from a policy perspective, from a practice perspective, which would include, from a practice perspective, maybe including the voice of those who are at risk. I mean, how could we, for example, bring some ideas from the views from the frontline report into the GAR, or even better, in the HFA2? How could we use the GAR to establish this dialogue and to create, I mean, an opportunity for different stakeholders to collaborate?